Hello and welcome to the Schola Progenium. Today I'm going to be starting a really exciting series for me, which is a series of videos which is going to help beginner players and new Blood Angels players who are just maybe veterans who are starting a Blood Angels army understand how to use Blood Angels effectively so that they can win loads of games in the name of the Emperor. But I've had to think long and hard about how to use this or how to structure these videos because I don't want to be boring for people who are veteran Blood Angels players who watch my videos, maybe while they're painting or for whatever their motivation, and I don't want to create a series of videos which are just, basic tactics and not very interesting to people who know what they're doing. So I've decided to structure these videos in a way that should hopefully be interesting to both new players and helpful to both new players and old players and veteran Blood Angels alike. So I'm going to start off this series with a video on what I think is the core ethos of playing with Blood Angels, how you should be approaching your strategy, how you should be approaching your battles and your tactics in the game, and sort of the ethos that you should keep in mind when coming up with all of your other tactics and all of your lists and everything else, the core foundation of the mindset of a Blood Angels player. So what is the core Blood Angels ethos? Well, it can be summed up very simply in one word, which is Blitzkrieg. But I don't want to use Blitzkrieg as a misnomer because Blitzkrieg was very much a term that was not used by the forces that were employing it at the time. It was coined by their opponents, by the Allies. And Blitzkrieg tactics were very much just the natural evolution of Prussian military doctrine that had been going on since around the 17th century. Now, it may sound silly to talk about sort of 17th century military doctrine or the evolution of Prussian warfare when we're looking at Blood Angels in the 41st millennium. But if you'll bear with me for a second, I just want to sort of give you a look at the mindset of a Prussian officer and how they were trained to think and deploy their forces on the battlefield, because it's actually very interesting and it speaks really clearly and really obviously to the way we should be using our forces on our 40k battlefields to win games for the Emperor. So as usual, I'll break this video down into two broader sections and then look at those sections in more detail. So the first section will briefly look at the mindset of a Prussian military officer. And then secondly, we'll look in more detail at how we can develop strategies on the battlefield with this sort of blitzkrieg ethos in mind and what that actually looks like in 40k. So without much further ado, if you will allow me to, I will give you a glimpse at the mindset of the Prussian doctrine as it was developed and why it was developed so precisely in this direction and very intentionally developed to form this way of conducting warfare. So, when we're looking at the characteristics of the Prussian officers on the ground, they were very much characterized by their initiative, the maneuverability of their forces, and their aggressive command during operations. Now, they focused after around the mid-17th century on using tactics that employed an oblique order. And what this means, and I'll go into this in a much more detailed video in the future, but what an oblique order effectively means that you focus your strongest forces on the enemy's weakest forces to very quickly destroy them whilst keeping your sort of main force, your weaker forces out of the way, your more vulnerable forces out of the way. And then you bring them together on the remains of the enemy forces to destroy them. This is something we do all the time. This is something I advise all the time. If you've got your big old jump pack, sanguinary guard or death company unit that's deep striking, and taking on and wiping out a chunk of the enemy forces, whilst the rest of your main army gets into line and position and attacks elsewhere, and then you bring the forces together and destroy the enemy. That's just absolutely classic Blood Angels tactics. And that is something that we use all the time. And that was something they were trained to do and to employ on the battlefield. It was something that was just drilled into them. That was how they were taught warfare was done, because when you join the army, you sort of think, right, I'm going to be a soldier, but you don't know how warfare is done. So that was their entire sort of mindset. That was how they saw warfare was done. That was all they knew. That was what they were taught from day one. And this is what you need to start from. This is what you need to think about from day one. And this is what you need to be doing with your Blood Angels. Now, they had a real emphasis on aggressive attacks. And this means like a willingness to attack, even when you're outnumbered, even when you've got fewer forces. You need to aggressively attack and employ those forces to take a chunk out of the enemy and even the odds so that you can, then fight on and win that battle. And that's something that we need to do all the time. I'm always talking about trimming the fat, taking away a chunk of the enemy forces so that as the game evolves and in the later phase, you can play more effectively for board control and control those objectives. So that's something that's, really important for us, something that was drilled into them. Another sort of thing that was drilled into them was a willingness to sustain casualties for a quick and decisive victory. And I think this is really key for us because I'm always talking about in my other videos, maintaining momentum on the battlefield and, the importance of keeping your forces pushing up on the opponent and not letting them sort of stop you pushing them back and back, and so that you can control more and more of the board and more of the battlefield in your games of 40k. And to do that, you have to be willing to, sustain a lot of casualties because you're really in their face and you're sacrificing, some expensive units because they are so able to kill the opponent and destroy the opponent, and they'll take so many of the opponent's resources to try and stop them, and ultimately they'll fail. So you've got to be willing to sustain casualties for a decisive victory. And the reason why they did that was because, where they are located geographically, if they're ever going to start a war, they had to be able to get it done quickly, get any battles finished quickly and move on quickly, get any engagements, any hard points destroyed quickly so they could always be pushing on so that no other country would come and invade them because they were surrounded on all sides because, they're in Central Europe. But it's important for us because we need to control the board. And to do that, we need to push the opponent back and herd them into an area of our choice so that we can then deploy our other forces onto the objectives in the later phases of the game. So it still matters to us. So that was their mindset. That was how they were drilled. That was their view on warfare. And that should be your view on warfare. You need to be aggressive in your attacks. You need to be willing to attack when you're outnumbered, attack against the odds. You need to be willing to sustain casualties to get the job done. I think this was just summed up brilliantly by the historian Hans Delbruck. And before I made this video, I thought, right, I know my tactics, know what I'm talking about, but I'm going to look into a little bit of Blitzkrieg so I don't sound like an idiot on the internet. And I read this sentence, and it said he was talking about an attack and sort of how it tied into the Prussian tradition. And he said, which by daring to lose a battle wins it. And I thought that absolutely speaks volumes to me as a Blood Angels player, because I'm always risking my sort of high value units, my most expensive units in my list, and I'm risking them in assaults, but it's calculated. And in doing that, I can overwhelm my opponent and take control of the battlefield and win the battle, win the engagement itself. So how does all this look? How does it all come together on a battlefield in a game of 40k? Well, I think it basically can be summed up into a few key points. Now, you need to keep your army fast moving. You can't just have a gun line with Blood Angels. It's not going to work that way. And I think that's pretty obvious, but I have used a sort of section of my army as a gun line on many occasions, and that can be very useful. You can have a fire support section There's nothing wrong with that. You can have predators with last cannons, heavy bolters. That's a really good unit because they can spray out Dakar at long range and last cannons. And if you've got, just one on its own won't be very good because it's only got 2 last cannons, 6 heavy bolter shots. That's not going to contribute much. When you duplicate that, the sum of it is sort of greater than its parts, and you can really sort of hammer down with a really effective fire support sort of unit, whilst the rest of your forces can push forward and be really fast moving. And then those tanks can always spread out in the later phase of the game, cover a couple of battlefield objectives. So, your fire support units are really fast moving there as well. So your whole army needs to be fast moving. You need to be creating disorganization in the enemy ranks. So they can't really, you need to prevent your opponent, so to speak, from regrouping effectively. So you're constantly slamming your assault units into the enemy lines, smashing apart their support units with your long-range support firepower, or just, tearing them apart with all of your army pushing forward. It doesn't matter sort of how much you hold back, how much you push forward, but you need to constantly be fracturing the opponent's lines and sort of splitting their units up into smaller chunks and then swallowing up those smaller chunks. And you do that by sort of concentrating your forces. So a concentration of forces is really, really important, and that's very fundamental to Blitzkrieg. Concentration of armor was fundamental to Blitzkrieg in World War II, and your concentration of forces. You need to have your really hard-hitting units slamming into focused points on the opponent's lines to disrupt them and again fracture their lines, as I've said. And another benefit to concentrating your forces is to sort of have bigger units that are heavy hitting, because then your command points are more valuable. So it may be tempting to have sort of 3 units of 6 Death Company or something like that, and trying to get at least one of them to get the charge off. But that's not as effective as having all of those guys combined into sort of big unit of 12 or 14 Death Company. You don't even need as many Death Company that way. And then you can just spend the 2 command points to affect all of your Death Company at once, or all of your Sanguinary Guard at once if you have one big blob of Sanguinary Guard. So they can all use 3d6 to charge in on your opponent. Or if you want a unit to strike twice, strike again at the end of combat to honor the chapter, I think the stratagem's called, then, again, those command points are going further because you've got a concentration of force. You've concentrated all of your elites into bigger units, and you've got fewer bigger units, but your command points go further. Those units are more effective. They're harder to take down. They take more resources to get rid of, and you are always sort of bullying and overwhelming opponents' units and fracturing their lines, which is something I've said many times, creating that disorganization, causing your opponent to desperately try to prevent your assault so that your other forces can take control of the battlefield and the objectives elsewhere as the game goes on. So you need to maintain your momentum. You need to have your units working together. So you do that by combining your forces. So you're not just using that one blob on its own as a Death Star. You need that one blob because it's more efficient and it's better to concentrate your forces, but you also need to be combining your units and your forces together. So you need to be supporting that big blob with firepower and with backup units, with infantry units, assault marines, tactical marines, and transports. Then your assault always needs to be backed up, and you need to be really concentrating your forces, maintaining momentum, combining your forces. All of this ties together. This is the core ethos of the Blood Angels. And this sort of combines together to one sort of or 2 sort of core underlying principles, which is that you need to be making short, decisive engagements. So that sort of goes back to what we discussed earlier, that mindset of having quick engagements, because with your units, again, because you've got these big blobs, that will hit an opponent's unit, and possibly even 2, because you can multi-assault, and you want to wipe them out straight away in one turn, or at least guarantee to wipe them out in their turn of combat, but ideally just wipe them out straight away and move on, or maybe consolidate into cover or something like that. But you need to be wiping units out straight away. You can't be getting into battles of attrition, because, again, this will delay your momentum. This will slow you down. You don't want to be getting tar pitted. So, again, you need to be combining your forces. so that if one of your big units would be tar-pitted by a unit that they just simply can't kill in one turn, you've got another big unit or many support smaller units that can come in and help you finish the job, so your units can continuously assault and overlap each other. So you're just slamming into the opponent with relentless assaults, hitting them time after time after time, pushing them back, fracturing those front lines, creating disorganization, reconcentrating your forces, maintaining momentum, recombining your forces, constantly using your resources carefully. So that second sort of underpinning lesson is not, the first one's short, decisive engagements, and the second one is careful, precise use of resources. So, you've got your multiple units, you've got your big units, you've got your smaller units, you've got your support units at the back. And you constantly need to be recombining your forces, reconcentrating your forces, and sort of looking at what weapon combinations you've got in each unit, sort of how tough each unit is, what it can take in return after you've done your business. Because your opponent's going to have a turn after you, what sort of threat you're putting your units under, and whether that's worth it, and sort of whether your units will have the damage output capability to complete the objectives that you're going to set them, the tactical objectives within that turn. Destroy that tank, wipe out that unit, move on to that objective, take that bit of cover, whatever it is that you're ordering them to do. You need to carefully recombine and reconcentrate your forces and your multiple units each turn in order to maximize their efficiency and optimize their damage output and their capabilities and their survivability on the battlefield. So you're going to be continuously being aggressive, being very tactical, very maneuverable, and sort of really thinking about the best way to combine your forces each turn to just fracture the opponent's lines, capitalize on overwhelming units that have become exposed and swallowing them up, and sort of bullying units 2-on-1 and just pushing the opponent back and splitting their forces up and herding them away from the objectives, or possibly just onto one objective that they're going to hold on to and try their best to hold on to, whilst you deploy your other forces around the battlefield and take objectives. So that is basically, fundamentally, the ethos of the Blood Angels. That is Blitzkrieg looked at in detail. You need to be using your multiple assault units. You need to be using your fire support in combination. You need to effectively and precisely use your resources to complete short, decisive engagements that continuously fracture and overwhelm the opponent's lines, so that you take control of the battlefield and win games for the Emperor. So I hope this video has been enjoyable for you guys. I hope it's been entertaining. I hope it's inspired you to take the fight to the enemy and be aggressive, not be afraid to get stuck in. So thank you very much for your time. This has been the Schola Progenium. Goodbye.